Welcome to Serverless Django with Zappa. I'm Edgar and I'll be your instructor for this course. Let's discover what this course is about and what students will learn. This course guides the student to take almost any Django application and to deploy it into a serverless environment in the cloud. Specifically, the Amazon Web Services, or AWS Cloud, using the AWS Lambda service. The course will focus on an open source tool called Zappa that will make this process very straightforward. Zappa effectively configures AWS to provide a web hosting platform. Django processes web requests as if it's running on a traditional server, but it's actually on AWS Lambda. Running in a serverless environment means you aren't renting a virtual server for hours or days. You just pay for the CPU cycles needed to handle your web requests. By leveraging the serverless environment, you can reduce maintenance overhead, support multiple cost-effective environments, and improve security. So why host Django in a serverless environment? By harnessing the full power of Django with Zappa and AWS Lambda, you can avoid the overhead of server maintenance and configuration. No more OS patches or security fixes for your web server software, except for keeping Django up to date. Just focus on writing the Django code and serving your customers. By using Zappa and AWS Lambda, you get extreme scalability with low upfront costs. AWS Lambda is a powerful tool and, combined with a Zappa utility, makes migrating an existing Django application into a serverless environment very easy. It unlocks the potential to have multiple development and testing environments for extremely low overhead and cost. Imagine having the ability to run a full test suite for new features without requiring complex orchestration software while keeping costs low. Who benefits from this course? If you are a solo developer working on a Django project, then this course is perfect for you. You will get the benefit of a secure, scalable environment without a lot of the hassle of ongoing maintenance. And you won't have to invest a lot of time in setting up your infrastructure. Finally, if your project doesn't get a lot of activity, it's possible to run the project for nearly free. If you are part of an organization that creates Django projects, then this course is also for you. You can easily create low-cost but high-performance replica environments for your development and QA folks. Depending on your production traffic load, moving to a serverless environment may save on AWS billing. So let's talk about the course topics. In Module 1, we're going to be setting up your local machine to do successful development for the cloud. In Module 2, we'll deploy your first project using Zappa. Module 3, we'll configure your Django project to serve static files. Module 4, we map a custom domain name to your project. Module 5, we connect to a database. And Module 6, we walk through all the steps, but this time in a secure network environment. Why serverless? It's important to understand what it means to run in a serverless environment. Let's compare the old school or traditional way of using a server versus the new school or serverless environment. Just an important note I want to point out. A serverless environment actually uses servers, but those servers are managed and maintained by Amazon on your behalf. So there's no overhead or extra steps you need to do. Here's a typical web server stack for a Django application, showing the top of the stack and moving down toward the bottom. At the top of the stack is your Django project, your code that you write. Underneath that is Django and the Python packages. You download and assemble these to get your project working. Underneath that, whether you know it, is a Web Services Gateway Interface, or WSGI. This layer takes the web requests and transforms them into a form that Django can consume easily. Underneath that is Apache or Nginx, some sort of web server software that you have to install, configure, and patch. And then there's the underlying operating system, Linux in this case. It could be Windows, but you also have to install, configure, and patch, as well as get licenses for that, if applicable. Underneath that is some sort of hardware, the physical server that the operating system runs upon. You have to maintain that, or your hosting provider has to maintain that. And then finally, you have to feed the hardware with power, HVAC, or heat, ventilation, air conditioning, and physical security so no one tampers with your physical servers. You or your hosting vendor have to deal with that. Now let's compare that stack with a serverless stack. Once again, here's your stack layers. At the top is your Django project. That is unchanged. Django and Python packages also unchanged. You have to assemble those to create and configure your project. Next, we have a utility called Zappa, which we'll talk about in just a second. It's an open source tool that packages web requests to your Django project. Supporting Zappa is AWS Lambda, which is your execution environment. Associated with that is your AWS API gateway that actually receives and distributes HTTP requests. And finally, Amazon supports multiple regional data centers where they provide power, HVAC, and security. It's important to note that everything below Zappa is handled by Zappa. You can think of Zappa as your personal infrastructure team. It allows you to focus on the application software, not the supporting layers. AWS provides the robust web hosting without a lot of overhead maintenance. So what is Zappa and how does it work? The Zappa utility is an open source tool that enables a Django or Flask application to operate in the AWS Lambda serverless environment. This probably sounds like a lot of buzzwords, so let's break it down into more understandable parts. In short, Zappa creates and configures a compatible AWS environment for your Django or Flask project. This means your Django project runs in the cloud without having to worry about setting, configuring, or maintaining your own web server. The AWS Lambda environment handles all that while you focus on writing your application code. Unlike some other minimal serverless deployment tools, Zappa comes with built-in support for WSGI requests routing to Django or Flask, but you can also run periodic jobs such as database maintenance, calculation jobs, or send messages similar to Celery without the overhead. Easily map a custom domain name to your project, or respond to many AWS events such as S3 uploads, DynamoDB entries, Kinesis streams, SNS messages, and SQS messages, and more. A key benefit of Zappa is that once you have it in your project, there are no external dependencies to use Zappa. That means you don't have to create a Zappa account or anything like that. It's free to download and use for everyone. Naturally, your project will have package dependencies that you specify in your requirements file, and Amazon Web Services needs to be running, but aside from that, your environment should be self-contained. You may ask yourself, can I use serverless for everything? The answer is a resounding no. It's important to realize that not all applications should be serverless. Serverless applications are generally best for event-driven models like web servers, chatbots, or smart speaker apps. Since you're only paying for CPU cycles that your app uses, apps that are idle for long periods are ideal for serverless migration. If your applications perform heavy calculations or are CPU intensive, such as rendering, modeling, or Bitcoin mining, then look for non-serverless solutions. You'll probably find that AWS Lambda will not be cost effective for these applications. But if you're a solo developer or a small team of developers and you want to focus on getting your website up and running in a robust environment without a lot of overhead, then Zappa is for you. About the author. I'm Edgar Roman. I have over 20 years experience in the software development world, focused recently on online video streaming and cloud services. I've served as Senior Director of Product Development for the Public Broadcasting Service and have launched numerous streaming video services on web, mobile, and OTT platforms. I'm well-versed in network architecture with a focus on information security and high availability. I have led development teams to create high-profile strategic offerings for multiple companies such as AOL, HP, and Symantec, in addition to PBS. I was introduced to Django in 2009, and I consider it my go-to web framework, with continuous support from a vibrant community. In addition to an incredibly rich ecosystem, I would be hard-pressed to find another framework that matches up. I've been using Zappa to host my Django applications for several years now, and I have found no other solution that is as powerful and cost-effective as serverless Django hosting on AWS, especially for the solo developer working to get a product to market. I hope you enjoy this course and harness the power of serverless Django with Zappa in your projects. Class details. There are a number of additional details we'd like to cover about this course. For whom is this class? This class is targeted at folks who already have familiar with Python. You should be familiar with writing code in Python 3. Django. It would be best if you've written a handful of Django apps before and have some in production. This will give you the best perspective of how easy Zappa is to use. In this course, we will be writing simple views and models in addition to running various management commands. Virtual environments. Zappa depends on using virtual environments, so you'll find it easier if you use them before. If not, then you'll have to be very careful to follow the instructions closely. Amazon Web Services account. You'll need an AWS account and the permissions to manipulate a number of services. We'll introduce and discuss permissions in the course. All AWS console work will be carefully guided and demonstrated. In addition, we will make heavy use of Docker. Don't worry, we'll walk you through all you need to know, but you will need to download and install Docker Desktop. Are there additional fees during this course? For this course, we will be using Amazon Web Services. Fortunately, AWS offers a generous free tier that allows us to deploy our Zappa projects for no cost. Even when we create our database, we'll have a year free. However, there are a few modules in this course where you may be charged some additional fees. In Module 3, where we map a custom domain name, you'll need to purchase and register a domain name. You can use any name registrar, including AWS itself. Once you have that, then you'll be subject to Route 53 pricing, which should be a few dollars per month. In Module 6, Getting Ready for Production, we establish a secure network environment. If your Django project will need internet access to fulfill web requests, then you may need an optional NAT gateway and thus subject to NAT gateway pricing. It's totally natural to have questions during the course. We strive to cover all the bases in the course material, but nothing is perfect. We encourage you to join the Newline Discord server and ask questions on the Serverless Django with Zappa channel. Within every lesson in the Newline platform exists a discussion tab where you'll be able to ask a question at a certain timestamp within a video or make comments on the page. We'll try to respond to these comments in a timely manner. What if I find an error? While we don't have Knuth bucks, we do try to keep our courses quite accurate. Please reach out using one of the methods mentioned, and we'll try to resolve the problem. A note about the videos. Some of the tasks shown in the videos may take from 30 seconds to 45 minutes. For the short duration waits, the video has been edited to save student viewing time. Long duration waits are called out in the video itself. Disclaimers, legalese, yada yada. Occasionally, we mention an outside vendor or additional service that you may wish to integrate into your project. Any external links are being provided as a convenience and for informational purposes only. They do not constitute an endorsement or an approval by the authors of any of the products or services. Contact the external site for answers to questions regarding its content. Okay, all that's out of the way. Let's get started with the course. You're going to need an AWS account to get rolling here on this course. If you have your own AWS account, great. Or if you have access to a company AWS account, you may need to work with the group that manages AWS in order to get this access here. But I'm going to assume that you have your own access here. And I'm going to walk you through creating a Zappa utility user. Now, the Zappa utility actually makes things as easy as possible for you, and it does things on your behalf. So in order to enable the Zappa utility to manage things in AWS, we're going to have to create a Zappa user that is going to be used. Some of the things it does on your behalf is it creates an S3 bucket for deployment when you push up to the cloud. It creates Lambda execution IAM roles. It creates API gateways so that web traffic can get to your Lambda, and a lot more stuff. It makes it very easy for us to use, but first we have to create the account. So it really needs two different types of permissions, which we'll get to in a second. So first of all, what you want to do is log into your AWS console and go to the IAM access. On the left-hand side, you're going to click on users, and then you're going to click on add user. And we're just going to call this one Zappa user. For the access type, we're just going to pick programmatic access. This means that it's going to use the API to interact with AWS. We don't need to check the box for management console access because the Zappa user will never log in to the consoles. And that's what you're seeing right here. Let's move on to permissions. It's easier if we just attach existing policies directly. And so there's two policies we'll need to access. One is IAM full access. It needs to be able to create users on your behalf in order for the Lambda to be executed. And then we need power user access to create things like API gateway and the S3 bucket, so on and so forth. Tags optional. This is usually used for billing purposes. We won't use this here in this course. Let's go to review as Zappa user, programmatic access, no boundary, IAM access, power user. Great. And we'll go ahead and create the user. What we see now is the brand new user and the access key and the secret access key that are going to be used by our utility. And we're going to have to save these credentials. So we're going to save them into the default location that all AWS credentials are usually stored on a user's directory. So this is in your home directory. You want to change directory or make a directory called AWS. And then within the AWS directory, you're going to create a file called credentials. Every time that we run any sort of Zappa utility, it's going to look here. And once we configure this, we won't have to do it again. So what we're going to do is you see there's a default section here that is AWS access key and AWS access key secret. We are going to leave that alone and just cut and paste an extra section here. So this is the Zappa section so that if anyone looks at this in the future, you'll say, okay, these are specific to the Zappa user. And we just need to replace these with the exact ones from the website. So first we'll get this one, access key ID, paste that there, and get the secrets here. Now, obviously, these will be different for you. You should not share these because these are sensitive access and information. So, all right, now we have credentials file set up and our Zappa user set up. Keep in mind a couple things. This is the only time that you'll be able to see the access key and secret access key. If you hit close too quickly, it goes away and AWS will not let you see that again. And we are all set to move on to the next lesson. Hi, folks. Next, we got to set up our local system. The end goal is going to be able to run your Django application in the cloud, specifically on AWS Lambda. And it's best if we simulate that same environment on your local machine. If we develop locally, natively, either on Windows or Mac, when we install certain Django applications and modules, they may not be compatible with the runtime environment that AWS Lambda is going to provide. So in order to establish an environment that is most like AWS Lambda, we're going to go ahead and use Docker. If you haven't used Docker before, essentially it creates a virtual container on your system, and you can configure that virtual system however you'd like. Using Docker, we'll be able to simulate as closely as we can an AWS Lambda environment. So when we upload our AWS Django app to the cloud, it's going to be the most compatible we can get
and we're going to avoid unnecessary and unpleasant surprises if things don't work in the cloud. So what you're going to need to do is download Docker Desktop. It's a free tool at docker.com. Go ahead and download it now and install it. When you're done, at least on my Mac, you'll be able to see a little Docker icon when it's running. And if you go to the command line prompt, you can type in docker-v to get the Docker version. Now, this version that you see here may not match the version you have. It will probably be a later version, but all the versions of Docker are going to work fine. So once you've done that, we are going to go ahead and essentially download a pre-configured Docker image that's going to be very close to AWS Lambda. So there's a GitHub repo called lambda that have created Docker images that accurately reflect the AWS Lambda environment for various programming languages. Since we use Python, we're going to pull down the Python Docker environment. So what we want to do is type in Docker pull lambda. That's the organization that maintains this image. Lambda build Python 3.8. So 3.8 is the latest version at the time of this writing that is supported in AWS Lambda. So we're going to go ahead and run this command. What this command does is it downloads the image to your local machine so that you can run it without having to re-download it again and again. Now that we've downloaded the Docker image, let's create a folder for our project. I'm just calling it Serverless DZ course. You may call it whatever you'd like. And of course, this directory is empty. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a instance of the Docker container that we downloaded. So if we type in this command here, what it's going to do is invoke Docker, tell it to run an image. The -ti makes it an interactive mode, so we can use the terminal to interact with it. -v maps the local directory to the image directory var task, and the --rm deletes the container after we're done with this. We specify the Lambda image that we want, and we run bash, which is a shell. So once that starts up, you see we're dumped into a shell environment, and this shell environment is actually the Docker instance running. So this instance is like a little piece of AWS Lambda running on your local computer. And you can see that we have everything we need to run the Lambda environment. We're going to exit the shell, which causes Docker to kill the instance, and we're back to our local machine. Now that we've downloaded the generic image, we're going to customize it for our purposes. Next, we're going to create a custom Docker image. We do this using a Docker file. In your directory, go ahead and create a Docker file. I'm going to use VI, but you can use any editor you'd like, or VS Code. Make sure that the capital D is the only thing capitalized. The F in file is not capitalized. So I'm cutting and pasting, and we're going to go through this. You don't have to understand Docker files for this course, but it's nice to be able to understand what exactly this one's doing in case you want to customize it a little bit. The first line from indicates what is the base image to use for your custom Docker image. And of course, we're using the lambda Python 3.8 image. The next line here is to make the working directory var task. This is the default execution directory used by AWS Lambda. And so all your code is going to be dropped into var task when Lambda runs. The next item here is we're exposing port 8000. We do that so that anything running in our container on port 8000 will be accessible to our local machine on port 8000. This lets us browse the Django web application if we are running in debug mode. This next line here ensures that the prompt when you log in identifies itself as Zappa shell so that you know when you are running a Docker instance of this container. And then the last command is the command to use when running in interactive mode. Needless to say, you're not going to have to learn the intricacies of Docker files building it, but here's the steps that we're going to take to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now that this is created, all we do is run docker build t docker image. All right, so docker build is going to tell it to build a custom image, and the T tells it here's the Docker image to use. Here's the name of the Docker image to use. So our new image, once it's built, is going to be called Zappa Docker image, and the period just says use the current directory to build it. Okay, so that was quick, and we only had to do this once. Now we have a Zappa Docker image on our local machine that we can use for all our Zappa tools. Finally, the last thing we want to do is I want to create a shortcut so I don't have to type in that very long command, docker run, so on and so blah, 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 blah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a small script file. If you're on Windows, it's going to be called zappashell.bat or batch file. If you're on Linux, Mac OS, just call it zappashell.sh. So once again, I'm going to paste that command with a couple extra parameters here. So we have docker run and TI for interactive. Then we tell it to map port 8000 of the instance to the port 8000 of a local machine so that we can use the browser. We set up some environmental variables so that when we get to the Zappa utility, the AWS profile is selected as the same one we set up in the last lesson. The -v volume maps the current working directory to var task, and as we know, var task is where AWS Lambda runs the custom code from your project. And we're going to map another volume here, and it's going to be your .aws credentials directory. In your home directory, it's going to appear in the Docker container as /root.aws. This lets all your credentials you set up in the last lesson be exposed within the Docker container. And of course, --rm means delete the instance after the execution is finished. And we now replace the lamb CI Python image with our own Zappa Docker image that we just created. So having said that, go ahead and finish that. And now if we want to go ahead and run our shell file, it's going to start our custom Docker image, create an instance, Docker instance of that image, and put us in the shell. And suddenly now we know we are in the shell because this is running within the Docker instance. So this is as if we have an AWS Lambda environment on our local machine. And it's pretty easy to hop into and pretty easy to hop out of. Just type exit and we're all done. Finally, the last thing we need is a code editor. I recommend VS Code. Many people use it. It's very popular. But any code editor will do. Once you are comfortable with that, we can move on to the next lesson. Okay, folks. We're going to create a simple Django app in order to demonstrate the Zappa functionality. Eventually, you can use this with your own Django app, but for this course, it's going to be a very minimal Django application. Now remember, each time you start one of these lessons, you're going to have to activate the AWS Lambda environment in Docker that we've created. So make sure you're in this proper course directory, and you want to run source zappa shell.sh. And this is going to create a Docker instance, and it's going to give you a prompt that indicates to you that you are in the right environment. If you're not in this prompt, you're running on your local machine and things won't work properly. So back to Django. First, what we want to do is create a virtual environment. If you're not familiar with virtual environments, essentially they let a Python environment put all their packages into a single directory. So I just created a virtual environment called VE. Simple, straightforward. If you look over at our VS Code, we can see now we have a Docker file, our Zappa shell, and now we have a new directory for the virtual environment. Now we have to activate our virtual environment. Just a quick recap of where we are. We are in a shell in a Docker instance with the virtual environment activated. So this is a very important prompt that you'll see. The VE indicates that the virtual environment is active. The Zappa shell indicates that the Docker instance is running. So now we're ready to rock and roll. I'm going to install Django and Zappa. Note that a number of packages were downloaded as wheels. Now, wheels are binary versions of a package that have been compiled for a specific environment. Sometimes they're compiled for Windows or Mac or some other platform. That's one of the advantages of using Docker, is that we're downloading the packages that are appropriate. Okay, that's finished. Okay, now I need to create a new Django project. I'm going to call it Frankie. And I'm going to start the project in the current directory. So if we look over at our VS Code, we see Frankie has a very basic, generic Django project. So I should be able to start it up right away in a run server environment. Generally, when you use run server command, you don't need to specify a port or an IP address. I have to, in this case, specify 0 and then use the port 8000. This allows the Python mini web server to accept incoming requests from outside the Docker instance. So let's do that now. And we'll go to our browser and see what it looks like. That didn't work. Let's check to see what's happening. All right, we have an error here. The improperly configured SQLite or late is required. So this is the problem. Let's Control C and get out of our run server. What's happening here is that the AWS Lambda environment has an older version of SQLite that's not compatible with what we need. So unfortunately, we can't use SQLite. So what we're going to do is just comment out our dependency on SQLite. The default Django package uses SQLite as their default database. So I can go back to my VS Code here and find the Django settings file. And I'm going to scroll down, find where it says databases, and I'm going to comment out this entire thing. Because right now I don't need a database for my default application. So I'm going to save that. And we're going to go back to our run server and try to run this again. All right, that looks a lot better. Let's go ahead and go back to our web server. And look at that. We have a successfully working Django application. Pretty cool, huh? So just to recap, this Django instance is running within a Docker instance in a virtual environment, and you're seeing the output on your own local web browser. Okay. Now that we have a working Django application, let's add a Django application to our Django project. So I'm calling my application guitar, and I'm going to add a small view to that. So under the application, I'm going to find the views, and I'm going to add some default view. It's going to take the default request and return very simple hello world. Hello world. Who loves Django? All right, save that. And then I need to wire up the URLs. So I need to create a new URLs file, URLs py. And I'm just going to cut and paste some code that I've had before. So it just takes from the URLs path. We're going to import all our views. And now I need to wire up Frankie to have the entire guitar app going on. So from here, I just need to add path, which is a default path, include else.py, and we should be all set. Let's go ahead and run server again. I forgot to add include here. Should do it. And now if I refresh, I get my view rendering. Excellent. So in this lesson, we've created a very simple Django app with one single view, but that's enough for us to get started with Zappa. Okay, folks, I just wanted to emphasize one more time how important it will be to activate the environment that we've set up for all the lessons in this course. So let's just review what we have to do to get ready to run any of these lessons in the course. First, we have to make sure we're in the right directory. And then you'd like to source Zappa shell. This is going to fire up Docker and start our custom Docker image and put us into an instance of that custom Docker image. And then you want to make sure you activate your virtual environment. Now you should see the prompt just like you're showing here. Parentheses VE end parentheses space Zappa shell greater than sign. So this is now your operating prompt. You're ready to go to start running Zappa commands and the rest of these lessons. All right, let's get started with our first initialization of Zappa. So it turns out the Zappa utility uses a file called zappa settings.json to tell the utility how to configure and where to deploy your application in the cloud in AWS Lambda. All the configuration is stored in that file. And the good news is Zappa can actually create this file for you by asking a few simple questions. But first, remember to activate your environment before continuing. like we talked about in the last lesson and module. Otherwise, some of the commands we'll show here will not run. Okay, let's get started. It's a pretty easy command, Zappa Init, and it's going to start building that Zappa settings.json file for you. But it's also going to ask you a bunch of questions that we're going to walk through. All right, the first question Zappa utility is asking is, what do you want to call this environment? Now, recall that you can actually have multiple instances of your project deployed live in AWS Lambda at the same time. Now, a lot of folks use development, QA, and production as environments, but you can use however many stages you'd like. You can even have an environment for each developer and QA on the project. But for now, we're going to stick with dev for this course. Next, Zappa is going to ask you, what profile user do you want to use? Now, do you remember in the last lesson, we created a .credentials files with all the AWS credentials that we needed for this course? Well, we're going to go ahead and use the profile that we set up called Zappa in that file. If you have a different profile, you may use that, but if you're following this course, you should be typing in Zappa for this profile. When AWS Lambda loads code to execute, one of the ways it gets the code is to pull the code from a zip file stored on S3. Zappa will upload your code to S3 so that AWS Lambda can pull it down and execute it. As a convenience, the Zappa utility will actually create an S3 bucket for you. If you have your own bucket, you may enter it here. However, for this course, we're going to use the automatic generated bucket by Zappa utility. The good news about this S3 bucket is that it's only used during deployment. So when you're deploying code, the Zappa utility will stage a zip file on the S3 bucket and then immediately tell AWS Lambda to download it. After a successful download, the Zappa utility will delete the zip file it uploaded so that there is no additional overhead or charges in this S3 bucket. So Zappa automatically detects both Flask and Django applications. Since we're using Django, it has automatically detected the file frankie.settings, which is indeed our Django settings file. So we don't have to do anything except the default that it's already prompting here. This last question is asking you if you want to deploy to all available regions so that your Django application is accessible worldwide and as fast as possible. This is pretty much overkill for this course, so we're going to say no. We just want it in a single region. Finally, the Zappa utility is showing you what the Zappa settings.json file would look like, and it is all the answers to the questions that we've put in. And it looks okay to us, so we're going to say yes. And now the Zappa utility has created the file on our behalf and it's given us some extra guidance about next steps. Let's take a look at that Zappa file now in our code editor VS Code. If you notice, there's a new file called Zappa settings. And it has all the options that we've asked it to use. There's a new one here that says project name task. This is the name that the Zappa utility is going to apply to your project. Now, task is a pretty generic name, and so we're not going to use that. We're going to use something else. And project name is kind of an important setting in the Zappa settings file because a lot of the intermediate artifacts that Zappa utility will create in your AWS account will be named after the project name. So we're going to keep it very simple. It's best to use lowercase letters and maybe the hyphen symbol. So let's call it newline Zappa course and save that file. Great. Now we're all set to move on to the next lesson.